Greetings! My name is Roberto Valdez, Master of the Science of Geography and Instructor of History at Northern New Mexico College in Española, New Mexico. I'm here to talk to you about an era called Pueblo I, a time period which is an adjustment period for the Anasazi. They are an ancient people in the American Southwest-El Norte Mexicano. Their predecessors, which I covered in a prior lesson, were Basketmakers, and they were a semi-nomadic people in a way of life involving less and less hunting and more settlement because of their devotion to agriculture. The Anasazi, or ancestral Puebloans, became conformed to their namesake, people that evolved into a settled mode of living in villages we might think of as little pueblos. There are several main things to remember about these people. The Anasazi, or ancestral Puebloans, grew their reliance on agriculture. They domesticated the turkey, they conserved water for their farming activity, and because they don't have to struggle so much for their food, the people of this time period that we are about to discuss developed their art and their culture. They advanced the neatness and complexity of painted pottery. They innovate life in villages of permanent structures. Their ancestors, like I said, were basketmakers, and they lived in pit houses. They now evolve these into underground ceremonial chambers called kivas, while they are developing these other structures that are rectangular and above the ground. After this lecture, you may better be able to identify where the three main Pueblo cultures of Anasazi, Mogollon, and Hohokam lived. They were descendants of Basketmaker, or Cochise people in the American Southwest-El Norte Mexicano. Basketmakers are the ones that evolved into the Anasazi. The Mogollon and Hohokam are thought to be descendants of the Cochise people. So, also tell me what distinctive architecture set the early ancestral Pueblo people apart from the Basketmaker people will be your objective. This is what made archaeologists characterize the Pueblo I people as ancestral Pueblo people. They went from pit houses to room blocks. I want you to learn that the Anasazi continued to hunt and gather wild food. But why did they become dependent on the cultivation of domestic plants? Well, it was an easier way to eat. The people of Pueblo I culture conserved water in reaction to changing climate in the American Southwest-El Norte Mexicano. So, what do I mean by that? I'll give you a hint. It's finding ways to divert rainstorm runoff. I want you to learn why the turkey became important to the Anasazi. You're going to see some things made from their feathers, for example. In general, be able to identify some changes to the Anasazi artistic expression, society, and religion. This involves pottery and living in large communities that practiced ceremonies in larger groups, and they loved the calendar. And finally, learn that the Anasazi continued to evolve and proceeded to open this next period after this one called the Pueblo II period. In this map, we see the range of the three cultures of the Anasazi, also known as the ancestral Puebloans, the Mogollon, and the Hohokam. When we talk about the American Southwest, I use El Norte in conjunction with it because today's political boundaries of states and sovereign nations run rigidly over the physical geography. I want you to respatialize, that is to remove today's boundaries and see a culture like the Mogollon that covered basin range country on both sides of today's border. They extended from the Gila cliff dwellings in the north near Silver City, New Mexico, to a set of ruins in Chihuahua that I won't cover just yet. The Hohokam are thought to be related to the Mogollon, but more specialized in lowland desert agriculture by diverting water from streams. They were concentrated in the Sonoran Desert around the Rio Gila drainage. For the most part, this lecture will concentrate on the Anasazi, who are most relevant to our discussion concerning northern New Mexico. The Anasazi cultural area can be further subdivided into distinctions based upon the material culture archaeologists have found left behind. People and their culture are a product of their environment. That's what makes the Rio Grande Anasazi different from the Kayenta Anasazi, for example. I wish to point out two construction booms during this time period that we will favor in this lecture. Don't think for a moment that we are limited just to the areas that I will be talking about in this lecture, but I want to limit it in this lecture only for the sake of simplicity so that you get the main point of what this time period is about. There's this one in the northern San Juan Anasazi culture region at letter M, labeled on the map, letter M, which is Mesa Verde, and another at Chaco, where new above-ground buildings were constructed, and that's letter C. Take note of the years indicated on this screen. Before we take a short imaginary trip to Mesa Verde during Pueblo I period, I would like to introduce you to its location in the present day. It was made a national park in 1906 and is situated southeast of Cortez, Colorado, the state of Colorado, that is, and some distance away from Durango and Colorado and Farmington, New Mexico. It's a broad plateau about 2,000 feet above the Montezuma Valley at 8,000 feet in elevation, with a gentle slope and sloping downwards towards the south, and it varies from 12 to 18 miles roundish in shape. It has a high concentration of well-preserved archaeological sites spanning perhaps about 700 years or more of prehistory in the northern San Juan Anasazi cultural region. The mesa top is forested with juniper, cedar, piñon trees, and is bisected by many canyons and many finger-like mesas. Therefore, people living on top of it could easily defend themselves from marauding enemies. Because of its high elevation, they received better rains, and they availed of themselves of the good soil on top. And they had plenty of wood to keep themselves warm in winter or to build their homes. This is a diorama, or a miniature scale model, from the Chapin Mesa Archaeological Museum at Mesa Verde, and it shows a group of Anasazi people during the Pueblo I period, tending their cornfield, shown in the background, and in the foreground constructing a picket pole house. In this way, the transformation of a group of hunter-gatherers to farmers is similar to the Neolithic revolution that happened 12,000 years ago in the Middle East. Here in the Southwest-El Norte, we catch sight of the process happening dating to around AD 800. Shown here are upright posts providing the framework and upright poles that we call in New Mexico Spanish varillas. They are set in the ground and lashed together. Then they are daubed with mud. We call this style of building in New Mexico Spanish jacal. Jacal. The J is sounded as ha. Jacal. Pit houses are still in use, but they get deeper. In the same way, a framework of posts and varillas are used, and this is covered with fine material like quipas or juniper bark made into a fibrous mass and other substances, and then topped off with mud. These larger and deeper pit houses continue as living and workspace for winter use during this time period, that is. This exhibit at the Chapin Mesa Archaeological Museum at Mesa Verde National Park demonstrates how the function of the pit house evolves into two building styles. This split in architectural styles grows more and more extreme over about 100 years of time. The above-ground buildings use less and less framework and more stone and mud as time goes on. Meanwhile, the pit house grows deeper and larger and rounder until they are virtually flush, that is, their ceiling or roof is virtually flush with the surface of the ground. While both continue as living and workspace, the above-ground building will serve as storage. The below-ground chambers become increasingly important to the men for their workspace and to perform ceremonies. By the middle of that era, it has, or I should say time period, it has made a transformation to the kiva, the Pueblo Indian ceremonial chamber that can be found in pueblos even today. A kind of community meeting underground chamber called the Great Kiva makes its appearance as population increased. The writing is kind of small on this exhibit that is appearing now, so I've taken the liberty of enhancing it for you. It says, House of Adobe and Stone. This was the first step towards stone masonry. Only a few stones were used at first, and the walls were still principally of adobe, or adobe. Thin slabs were often placed at the base of the walls. Basically, it's saying that masonry, or rocks held together with mud, will become increasingly favored over the jacal style of building of using varillas chinked with mud over time. The Anasazi of Pueblo I often availed themselves of the wisdom of their predecessors, the people of Basketmaker III, who chose places most favorable for living and managing the agricultural projects around them. So they modified or built their house blocks on top of or near Basketmaker ruins. In this site plan, or downward-looking illustration of the layout of a typical Pueblo I multi-room dwelling called a house block, you'll notice the obvious semicircular shape with the open end facing south and east. This takes advantage of the rising sun to warm it for much of the day. In today's world, easy availability of energy often encourages waste. They use the obvious social warmth advantage of what we call in Spanish a resolana, or warm south-facing wall, to relieve the necessity and the drudgery of having to harvest so much fuel wood. In these days, parties of people would go out with only a stone axe and their bare hands. They pulled apart trees and brought fuel wood from increasingly longer distances. As they cleared the forest around their house block, they increased the size of their cultivation nearby. They were a settled people with more secure food sources, and they weaned their children earlier, and they had more children. As populations increased, the villages grew larger. They domesticated the turkey and constructed pens out of upright poles to pen in their turkeys. These people have not forgotten their roots, and out of necessity they continue to hunt and gather. Archaeologists find hunting campsites dating to this period, and this helps to hunt during the droughts that came in the years AD 850 to 930 in the Mesa Verde region. The Anasazi favored living in the upper Sonoran and transitional life zone where the rains were better. This is the life zone of juniper, cedar, pinon, and for the transitional life zone, that's usually characterized by the presence of ponderosa pine. So this is within the range of 5,200 feet to 7,700 feet in elevation in the northern San Juan Anasazi region that we're featuring in this presentation. They build check dams, and they channeled rainstorm runoff. In time, the climate got drier and colder, so it became risky to plant crops. The drought that occurred from 850 to 930 caused a drop in population. Many moved south to Chaco, where it was warmer, returning generations later to join kin who had stayed. And here is an example of a check dam, which is in the area called hang on, I'm drawing a blank here. It is on the border between the state of Utah and the state of Colorado. That is Hovenweep. So Hovenweep is a collection of unique northern San Juan Anasazi ruins that feature, among other things, these small towers and other unusual building architecture that comes to flower in the era after this one. But the point that I want to make with this check dam, which is the construction of a little masonry blockage of an arroyo, they also, in conjunction with it, constructed little channels that every time it rained hard and the arroyos would run with water, they would channel this water out into their agricultural fields. and thereby avail themselves of the advantage of having water runoff. Pueblo I was a time to innovate artistically. So a settled agricultural lifestyle meant gaps in time not spent looking for food, and yields of enough food surpluses were available that gave people time to improve their lives and even engage in leisure. This led to agricultural, or I should say cultural, innovation and artistic expression. So pottery becomes neater or made neatly. Some of it is made for cooking and others for non-cooking purposes that could be painted with increasingly complex designs. I don't mean to say that all pottery was painted. Some was left rather plain. But when they were painted, they often were gray, and they had painted on in dark colors, black colors, a neckband, and those predominate. And then there were some of the black and white and decorated redware, that is, it's the color red. One of the main uses of pottery was to shield grain from rodents. So what you could do is seal the mouth with a flat rock and even use resin from the piñón tree that we call in New Mexico Spanish trementina. It's a sticky stuff. It's basically the tree's blood. So it coagulates, it turns hard, it sticks to your fingers, but you could use it to seal anything and protect it from rodents in a sealed chamber such as a pot. In addition, without interruption, was the continued reliance on fiber arts, which was endowed to the Pueblo people from their ancestors and predecessors for bedding and clothing, including like the sandal shown here on this photograph at lower right. The fiber arts included the weaving of blankets on looms. It involved combining plant fiber with animal products to make clothes and blankets. What they did was set up a loom or columns of strings of yucca fiber tied to upper and lower beams anchored to the ceiling of a room and the walls of the room. They interlocked into those strings, which was called a warp, strips of rabbit and wood rat hide with the hair still on. At lower left, you can see a blanket made of rabbit, and the other involved their domesticated turkeys, whose feathers were woven between columns of string of yucca fiber. You wear the blanket like a sarape. Now, notice the photograph at upper right. You can see a winter boot, and that's woven by a finger looping technique, different than using a loom, and out of a turkey feather yarn. Now, that one is from a cliff dwelling called Mug House in Mesa Verde. During the prior Basketmaker period, a hunter-gatherer way of life was best lived in smaller groups, moving from place to place, allowing the land to recover from the impact of berry picking, root digging, rabbit hunting, deer hunting, and so on. Domesticated plants, the need to care for those crops, and a more permanent lifestyle drew in these groups of related families. They evolve into these tightly integrated groups, calling a specific place their homeland, and investing more and more time and effort to making a living there. As a consequence, religion begins to change. There was this kind of thing called shamanism. Shamanism is a belief in gods, demons, and ancestral spirits. The spirits they believed in would respond only to the shamans, and in this way, shamanism is a kind of religion oriented around an individual. During Pueblo I, however, the growth of integrated groups living in house blocks and looking after the crops of the three sisters, that is, corn, beans, and squash, meant that there are now communal ceremonies. So reliance on agriculture requires timekeeping by observing the signs of seasonal change and looking at the heavenly bodies. Doing so is a religious practice because it means looking for signs in nature and responding to this as a community to master control of their circumstances. For this reason, the careful keeping of a calendar takes on a religious importance, as well as planning when to plant. So let's review important date ranges and characteristics of the Pueblo I period. First off, It lasted from Anno Domini AD 750 to 900. Remember that this is a period of adjustment for the Anasazi, who embraced agriculture and permanent villages that are above-ground multi-room structures called room blocks. Initially, they're made out of upright poles called the Hakal construction, and that will evolve into masonry later on, but you don't need to obsess about that detail yet. It will be a bigger issue when we cover the next time period called Pueblo II. Now, pit houses turn into ceremonial underground chambers called kivas, and they tend to be flush with the ground, that is, their rooftops, with a roof hatch that you go down into with a ladder. The Anasazi experience a population boom in the northern San Juan Anasazi region, such as the notable and the famous Mesa Verde. There is an associated construction boom there as well. These people come under hardship when the climate turns drier and colder, and thereby unreliable for successful crops. As a consequence, beginning in the year 850, there's a tremendous drop in population, and likely a migration to the south, to the Chaco Anasazi region. There, a massive construction boom is occurring, or I should say begins, and only later will people migrate back into the upper part of the northern San Juan region, the Mesa Verde region, and so forth. So keep this in mind. So here's part of our conclusion. Some scholars figure this period to have an early beginning at AD 700, but we set the date at 750. And there are three main identifiable Pueblo cultures that are appearing in the American Southwest-El Norte Mexicano at this time: the Anasazi, the Mogollon, and the Hohokam. The practice of hunting and gathering still persists. Material culture like pottery becomes more neat, complex, and artful. Populations form integrated communities out of smaller family units of hunter-gatherers. They practice communal religious ceremonies, evolving away from shamanism, where religions center around one guy who contacts the spirits. Water conservation, like check dams and channels of storm runoff, is practiced due to an ever drier climate. And the reliance on agriculture inspires obsession with calendars that take on religious importance. This concludes the lesson on Pueblo I.